Carlo Crivelli's 15th century altarpiece painting of Thomas Aquinas gives us one of the major figures of the 13th century, that growth of the universities and the transformation of learning that took place. Thomas's Summa, about which we will speak in a few moments, became, following Peter Lombard, the great text of medieval theology, although Thomas himself would write a commentary on Lombard's sentences, which he highly esteemed. The major development in the West came in the 12th century in terms of an intellectual revolution, with the recovery of the works of Aristotle, who had been partially known through his logical writings known as the Organon. The source of this recovery was the rich tradition of translation and commentary on Aristotle in the Islamic world. In the great centers of Muslim intellectual culture, Aristotle had been brought into Arabic, and it was in Spain where this intellectual exchange between Christians and Muslims took place. In the 11th century, Christian scholars came to Toledo looking for Arabic works to translate into Latin. Through Spain, where there was such a rich tradition of work on Aristotle, the texts of the philosopher were available to Christian scholars, including the Metaphysics, De Anima, on the soul, and the Physics. By the beginning of the 13th century, scholars had most of Aristotle's major writings. The result should not be underestimated. It was nothing less than the complete transformation of the Western intellectual culture. But not just Muslim, but Jewish scholars were crucial to the reception of Aristotle in the West. Maimonides, who died in 1204, had written his Guide for the Perplexed. The most important of the Muslim commentators were Avicenna, who died in 1037, and Averroes, who died in 1198. The 13th century was an extraordinary period of intellectual and theological development. Aristotle had now been received in full, and a recovery of his tradition and legacy was begun by his availability in Latin. The commitment of the mendicant orders, the Dominicans and Franciscans, to the education and service of the Church was central. And the framework for this intellectual culture was the Bible. But alongside the Bible, the other sources about which we have spoken. For the law, it was the Justinian Code, Gratian's Decretum, and the Papal Decretals. For the Bible, it was what was known as the Glossa Ordinaria, the standard gloss of the Bible, in which interpretive passages from the Church Fathers were placed together with the verses of the scriptural text. The Bible, as we have said, was at the heart of the work of the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And when we come to talk about Thomas and Thomas's great work, the Summa Theologica, we see that the Bible itself is at the very heart and center of his endeavor to explain theology. The supreme representative of the mendicant scholar in the 13th century was indeed Thomas Aquinas. Here in this representation, holding up the church. He wrote a vast body of work in Paris, but in other centers across Europe. And that work covered the whole range of scholastic theology. Thomas was born into the family of the Counts of Aquino near Naples. He studied at the Benedictine house of Monte Cassino and went to the University of Naples. And it was there he came into contact with the Dominicans, known as the Black Friars, and decided that he would himself become a mendicant. In 1245, he went to Paris to study with Albert the Great, the preeminent theologian, who then moved to Cologne on the Rhine, and Thomas followed him. Thomas became a lecturer in Bible and produced commentaries on books of the Old Testament. His first major work, like others of his age, was a commentary on Lombard's sentences. And soon after, in 1256, he became a professor of theology in Paris and taught both in Paris but also in numerous Dominican houses across Italy and France, in Naples, Rome, Orvieto, and then at the Santa Sabina in Rome, with which he is so closely associated. He was back in Paris several times and returned finally to Naples, dying in 1274. His collected works are enormous. Numerous people have tried to estimate how much Thomas wrote every day. It was an extraordinary level of output. He was a person of incredible energy, imagination, and intellectual force. His writings, as I've mentioned, included and encompassed the whole range of theological inquiry in the 13th century. He wrote extensively on Aristotle and wrote for the students on liberal arts and has only over 500 writings on disputed theological points. But as this image here represents holding up the church, he was devoted to it. He was devoted to its liturgy. He was devoted to its piety. And he wrote some of the most beautiful hymns of his age, hymns that have endured in the church. His two most famous works were summae, the Summa contra Gentiles, which he wrote in the 1260s, which was designed for the preaching of Dominicans against Jews, Muslims, and heretics in Spain. It argued that Christian teaching did not contradict Aristotle's philosophy, but that reason needs to be completed by revelation. Then, the most famously, the Summa Theologicae, which he did never complete. It was written, amongst other reasons, as a handbook for those learning theology. And as such a work, it was divided into three parts. First, concerning God, the Trinity, and creation. Second, on ethics and virtues. And the third part on the incarnation, redemption, and sacraments. The work addresses more than 100 questions and contains over 1,000 articles. As I say, Thomas's rate of output in this Summa that was written towards the end of his life was incredible. And what he left behind is nothing less than one of the greatest works of Christian theology. Its three parts consist of 611 questions or topics. In it, he avoids referring, although despite the name, which may have been given to it at a later time, he avoids the use of the term theology in preference for sacra doctrina. And the purpose for which he wrote the text is perhaps, I think, best expressed in his prologue. In the prologue, he writes, "Because the doctor of Catholic truth ought not only to teach the proficient, but also instruct beginners, we propose in this book to treat of whatever belongs to the Christian religion in such a way as to tend to the instruction of beginners. We have considered that students in this doctrine have not seldom been hampered by what they have found written by other authors, partly on account of the multiplication of useless questions, articles, and arguments, partly also because those things that are needful for them to know are not taught according to the order of the subject matter, but according as the plan of the book might require, or the occasion of the argument offer, partly too because frequent repetition brought weariness and confusion to the minds of the readers. Endeavoring to avoid these and other like faults, we shall try, by God's help, to set forward whatever is included in the sacred doctrine as briefly and clearly as the matter itself may allow." Thomas created nothing less than a new order of theological education. He was, before all, a teacher. He was a Dominican. He preached. He heard confessions. He wrote hymns. He cared for the people. This was not abstract theology set apart from the world. Thomas had come to think that theological education needed to be reformed. But what did he mean by sacra doctrina as a description? It meant that the instruction by which a master trains a student. It was knowledge of what one needed to have. Not a kind of intellectual, ethereal body of learning, but one that was practical, that taught of God's salvation. It was never a text simply for reading. It had the emphasis of teaching, of supporting, sustaining the church. It was about learning the truths of faith. It was the sources of Sacra Doctrina was nothing less than God's self-knowledge. We have to have the willingness to be instructed in what has been revealed. The novices mentioned in the prologue were already educated in theology. They already had studied Aristotle and the liberal arts. But Aquinas was teaching them to know more. For the complexity and depth of his work was in understanding truths that had been given in revelation. It was an exercise in Sacra Doctrina, in teaching and learning. In his life and in his work, Thomas Aquinas taught an age and an enduring lesson to the church of how to think theologically.